Okay, let's start with congenital rubella syndrome because people asked me to talk about it. And actually, it's the right one to talk about because during the craze of vaccination for rubella, it was never anywhere, if you look back on old reports anywhere, it was never assumed that rubella was ever a risk to children. Rather, the craze was all about pregnant women, right? So the concern was that if a woman got pregnant and she got rubella, her child would come out blind or deaf. And this narrative lasted all the way through to today. So they started saying vaccinate children with rubella as well because they're around mothers. And if a mother is around her child and her child gets rubella, then she can become infected and she can make future children blind or deaf. Let's check that out. Okay, so women at this time were actually opting into abortions if they discovered that they had risks that could have been associated with rubella. So they would take simple blood tests and they'd say, oh, you might have rubella, or if they were showing anything like a rash, which was really what it was, rash and a fever, they would opt into abortions because they were so terrified that their children were going to come out either blind or deaf. And this had been established since, as the CDC website said, 1941. So the first thing that I thought when I was like, okay, I want to look into this is there a study that actually shows that rubella causes blindness and deafness? Because that seems like a pretty good narrative. Remember, what they like to do is to traumatize mothers, right? To make you fearful that your children are going to be impacted. It's the easiest way to get us to move. So imagine if you're a mom at that time and you're worried your kid's going to be blind or deaf. Like, that is pretty serious. But has anybody actually examined the study behind this? So the first thing that seemed the most obvious to me was to dig up data on blind people in the United States, because if they are corresponding rubella with blindness in infants and children, then surely we should see some sort of an increase in cases of blindness and confirmed cases of blindness in 1964 and 1965 and 1966, which is when this rubella epidemic occurred on the East Coast in the States. This was the hardest data to find. It took me actually 2 full days of digging through troves, and finally I landed upon this basically a collaboration of 12 states that were very good at compiling data on the blind persons in their states. They got this data from ophthalmologists, optometrists, doctors, hospitals, and so they would basically say if you have a baby that's born with any eye issues, and they ranked on how the severity of how bad their blindness was, then it would go into this registry. So any new people that were added to the blindness registry were all populated into this 12-state alliance, if you will. And I'm going to now include the link and show you that chart, which has data from 1962 all the way up to 1970. Okay, so I was particularly interested in looking at the cases for Connecticut and Massachusetts in 64 and 65 and I guess 66, because you'll recall if you looked at that CDC link that I sent you for when they covered the rubella epidemic, Connecticut and Massachusetts ranked very high in having the most cases. Don't forget, rubella epidemic from the 1960s was an East Coast epidemic. So Connecticut ranked third and Massachusetts ranked fourth for the most cases in the states that were reported to the CDC. So I thought, okay, shouldn't we see a large increase in blindness that was added to the register in those states, since they're both member states, if you will? And that's just not what I saw. no meaningful variation whatsoever. So I thought, you know what, before I even try to understand why that could be, let me actually go back and find the study that the CDC mentions. You know, if you go back a couple of stories ago, they mentioned a guy at the top named Norman Gregg. They say he was the first one to establish, you know, to notice the relationship of cataract in infants' eyes after congenital rubella syndrome. So it should be very easy to find this study, and I'm going to go, ta-da, there it is. This is how he did the study, right? Wrong. Of course wrong. Of course wrong. This is where things always have to get weird. I also want to mention that it took forever to find this paper that he wrote, and you basically have to pay for it. I had to find it through JSTOR. I'm going to just link it for you in case you want to look at it yourself, and then I'm just going to recap it for you because I think that that's easier, but you can go read it in your spare time. They have heart defects. Okay, so I highlighted a very relevant portion for you because it's kind of insane. But basically, this is a guy named Norm, and he is in Australia, and he starts noticing that a lot of babies are born with low birth weight, and they're struggling to survive, and they have heart defects, and they have issues with their eyes. He's seeing a tremendous instance of cataract. And so Norman makes a hypothesis. He goes, you know what? Well, at the same time that we're seeing these babies, a lot of people also have rubella. Maybe rubella, I don't know if it's a toxicology or pathology, but maybe rubella, since it's going around, is what's causing this low birth weight and all of these effects. And he's like, and sure enough, I talked to the moms, and these moms have had rubella before. Some of them have had rubella before. And I spoke to my colleagues, and they basically think this is a good hypothesis. That's pretty much the extent of the study. It's just observational. Like, there's no mice involved, pregnant mice involved, nothing. He just is like, this could be rubella. And what's amazing to me is that this study, this paper, this hypothesis, this like me in my own eyes, like forming an equation, has withstood the test of time. No one has decided to do any follow-up studies. This is the number one thing that is cited. If you look through all of these studies that I have looked through trying to get to the bottom of this, they keep citing this ridiculous paper where he basically makes a hypothesis, which science, he should do. Maybe it's the rubella that is causing this, but he has not been able to establish any causal relationships because this is a post-analysis. These babies are already born, and he's just going, why are so many of them being born small with heart defects and cataracts in their eye? Me and my homies think it could be rubella. That's it. Fast forward to 1969, and they're trying to get this vaccine out, and they just start this scare with mothers, making them believe that if they get rubella, this is what's going to happen. Your child's going to be blind and deaf, and we're noticing all of these things, and they keep, sorting this, going back to this source, which isn't even a source. And then they started actually going to schools of the blind and the deaf, the government, and they started doing a post analysis and asking moms that have blind and deaf children, like, hey, could you have potentially been exposed to rubella, while you were pregnant? Did you have rubella? They start doing serological tests, taking their blood and going, well, you have the antibodies for rubella, so you're a likely probable case of congenital rubella syndrome. Taking blood from their children. Oh, he has the antibodies for rubella, so he's a likely case of congenital rubella. So we can now say with certainty that it's likely that this link is real. Who does a study like this? I mean, think about how ridiculous this is. That would be the equivalent of me right now going and finding a bunch of mothers who had children that were blind and deaf and saying like, hey, did you eat McDonald's while you were pregnant? And if those moms all said, yeah, I did eat McDonald's while I was pregnant, then I would just be like, McDonald's causes blindness and deafness in pregnancy. It's the equivalent of that. It's almost not even a study. It's confirmation bias because you're asking a question, but you haven't established this relationship ever, not even once. Here's where it gets even more interesting. So I find this other guy who did a study during this time. He was just interested in blindness, period. So he did not care about rubella. He made no links. But he noticed that in New York State, he was examining the blind, and he noticed that there was a very high incidence of low birth weight in these blind individuals. So that got me thinking, is there something else that could have been going on in the 1940s and the 1950s that caused low birth weight? And maybe the doctors missed it. Smoking. Smoking culture in America in the 50s and the 60s. Not considered to be dangerous at all. In fact, while you were giving birth, you were given cigarettes in the hospital when you went to the hospital. You were given cigarettes after you gave birth. Smoking was considered good for pregnant women to relax them. We didn't even get a Surgeon General's warning about smoking until 1966. So they say that, oh, actually, it could cause some problems. So throughout all of this happening, no doctor had fathomed for 1 second that the women that were smoking packs a day while they were pregnant could have been causing an issue with their children. Now, let's examine again what they say is caused by rubella during that time and what we know today for a fact through laboratory experiments with pregnant mice are the effects of smoke inhalation while you're pregnant. Now, of course, the entire medical industry was implicit in the cigarette smoking stuff. The FDA said there was no causal links between cancer and tobacco, and the doctors were all saying it was good for you. They were marketing it at this time. It's always hard to try to imagine the world decades ago, and we look at the world today. They're marketing it all the time for pregnant women. Pregnant women were in these ads smoking cigarettes, right? They loved the culture of smoking cigarettes. And so none of these studies looked at the potential harmful effects of tobacco, but they all were so focused on rubella because guess what? They had a vaccine coming out. And it is not a coincidence that they have done so many studies showing you that smoke inhalation causes all of these effects that they tried to pin the blame on rubella for, and they still have not done not even one study proving that rubella causes blindness, deafness, and was responsible for those heart defects. I am 1,000% convinced that they they successfully freaked out moms, took no ownership for what they were doing, which was basically promoting something that was extremely hazardous to a mom's health, obviously smoking cigarettes. And instead, because they had a vaccine coming out, they pinned it to rubella, assumed that nobody would go backwards and look at the fact that there are no studies confirming this whatsoever. And all of these babies that die as a consequence of these, this tobacco addiction, all of these babies that were born with, these congenital heart issues and this congenital, cataract and all of these things going on, never really knew that it was due to the culture of smoking. And that is how the CDC is. They just, FDA, CDC, the drug cartel, they assume that you're never going to go back and look into history because it takes too much time. But guess what? I had time.